All right. Hello, everybody. I am Harry Caulfield from the Berkeley Lab, and I realize that my slides are darker than they need to be right now. Let's fix that. There we go. Today I'm going to be talking about the relationship between OBO ontologies in the context of large language models, but specifically how we can kind of leverage these fantastic LLMs and all the applications that people have been developing with them recently in the context of perhaps bettering the ontology ecosystem and maybe even making some novel discoveries in the meantime. Now, I'm going to try to approach this from a relatively broad perspective because I think that the emergence of language models and some of the issues that we've been facing in adopting where generative AI methods really require a bit more of a philosophical viewpoint about why we do what we do, why we do biocuration, why we do any kind of data curation at all, really why we find these generative methods so but intimidating, but also very useful. So I'll go into a little bit of detail about, like what they actually are or what they actually do. But I'll also cover some ideas here about, well, whether knowledge creation or biocreation really is a job for humans still, uh, the potential risks that we face if we begin to adopt computational methods more for solving these particular tasks and interpreting biomedical data, especially in an ontological context, but also how we can focus a bit more on the strengths of generative AI approaches, including those implemented through LLMs. My overall philosophy here is that I think these are all complementary tools. I don't think we necessarily need to see them as competitive, and I think that people who frame it as a competitive solution probably have something to sell you, but that is often the case. So if you're not familiar with the kind of work that I focus on, I generally like to try to apply computational methods to extracting some kind of meaningful patterns from noisy or unstructured data. That's often text data, but in practice that could be other forms of data where you just don't know what the underlying pattern is or whether there even is a structure that you can immediately align it to. In many times that requires building novel tools and standards to more consistently share or perhaps more importantly understand biomedical data and observations. That's really has the overall goal of trying to discover some kind of novel connections between biomedical and biomolecular observations, particularly in a disease phenotyping context. I'd like to believe that many times this requires integrating data across different domains. Sometimes a particular phenomenon has been very well studied in a particular domain of biology or even elsewhere in science. There's some things that we've observed in a chemical context or perhaps even in a material science or maybe even a business intelligence context that turned out to have a lot of very useful implications for how we understand biological phenomena, but are rarely applied in that area simply because, well, the people who work in those spaces don't necessarily work together that much. Or if they'd like to, the data and the methods that they're using and producing aren't interoperable in a particular way. Sometimes they just don't operate under the same standards. Sometimes they think that they're actually looking at different concepts when in reality it's pretty much the same thing. So there are many points of connection between things that otherwise seem like are quite different. So let's zoom out even further here and try to grapple with the question of where does knowledge actually come from? And we can be very, very reductive and perhaps oversimplify the answer to this question and say, okay, well, it's the result of repeated observations. Uh, some of this harks back to the idea of the scientific method and okay, well, we need to make a hypothesis and then test our hypothesis, but we can make that even more general and say, okay, well, We want to learn from repeated observations that we're making. We want to consistently record those observations. And that in itself is challenging to do in a reproducible and consistent way. And increasingly, even if we look at the entirety of human knowledge, it becomes borderline impossible to record in a consistent way where we really are addressing that challenge that I alluded to earlier, where people are essentially observing the same thing, but observing it in different ways, in different contexts, in under different circumstances. Even within biology, we're very familiar with the idea that even something that we consider to be one disease may have a variety of different presentations, a variety of different phenotypes. For some diseases, it becomes very challenging to identify or diagnose a particular disease because it is quite variable in the ways that it can present itself. So even outside that disease context, how do we actually automate this process? How do we try to make it more consistent in a way that even outside a computational standpoint? How do we just automate the process of learning from literature? How would we automate consistently and reproducibly comparing findings across different studies and different sets of observations? And in that process, how do we integrate all those observations in a consistent way? Let's say we have different studies, different replicates, different knowledge bases where we've been collecting all these observations, different fields and disciplines, as I alluded to. Even within those different fields and disciplines, there may be different groups that ostensibly are studying the same things, but are doing it in completely different ways. How do we integrate their observations? And then across similar concepts, we know that they may be described in different contexts, and some of those are meaningful semantically. Some of them may actually refer to the same thing. Some of them actually may be different concepts that are biologically or physiologically relevant. And of course, we're quite familiar with many of these problems in the ontology space. And so we're very familiar with the need for structured data and structured relationships. Data models certainly help with addressing these challenges. Standards of representing the data and even just sharing it, or standard ways of representing the data files themselves internally certainly help, as do, of course, ontologies. And of course, this highlights the need for different ontologies as well. And ontologies not just focusing on different disciplines, but also on different ways of representing similar concepts. If you look at something like KEBI, we know that there's many different ways to represent the relationships between chemicals. KEBI gets into very specific detail, as I've shown here, about, okay, well, there's different kinds of subatomic particles, but then it also deals with relationships between chemicals and molecules at a very high level. As if to say, okay, well, this chemical entity has these properties, it relates these ways to these other chemicals, and some of those aren't necessarily things that you can represent if you're purely concerned with chemicals at the subatomic particle level. Now, of course, we can zoom out even farther and look at something like DUO, where, well, it's not even dealing with those specific discrete concepts anymore. It's looking at things at more the conceptual level and describing the properties of a given data set in terms of, okay, well, here are the things that you may use it for. Here are the permissions that you have. Here are the restrictions that you may have on reuse of that data. So in a very broad sense, well, these are all structured ontologies. They're all describing relationships between things. And in practice, to bring it back to my main idea here, we can automate the process of learning using a collection of all these ontologies. And I'll get to that in a moment. Because the key detail here is that we do actually need human experts in the process. And I alluded earlier to the challenge of curating some kind of structured information from unstructured data, often unstructured text. And ontologies will not do that for us. Data models will not do that for us. They help in the process. They are tools. So in practice, we need human experts, and we need to give them tools to work with. AIs can increasingly use the tools that humans would, but they're not quite ready yet to use them in exactly the way that human experts may want to use them. So that's not to say that there are not tools out there. In fact, there's a long history of tools for extracting information from unstructured text, and even decades ago, the processes for this, and even in the space of biomedical and biomolecular text, was to be solved with using rules and regular expressions and grammatical parsers. So these are very often very bespoke methods where you'd essentially say, okay, well, if I want to find every relationship between two things, I could say, okay, well, if I see a noun phrase and then the word and then another noun phrase, well, I will infer that there is some kind of relationship between those two things. So that's a rule that will certainly capture every instance where you know what a noun phrase looks like, and you can find it in the text, and they're definitely joined by the word and. But it may not have very much flexibility to any other kind of situations. And of course, we know in language there are multiple, and well, there's a great variety of different ways to represent the relationship between things. So increasingly, at least in the biomedical NLP space, groups introduced more rule-based extractors that would use entire sets of rules and try to combine them to have a more comprehensive understanding of what may be present in text. And so you see projects like SemMedDB attempted to use approaches like that to certainly to some success. We also saw the emergence of tools that were more based on enrichment of specific terms and annotations. So just the melody is just one example of these approaches. The basic idea there being, okay, well, if we see that one particular term occurs much more often in the context of another term, maybe it's in the same sentence, maybe it's in the same paragraph, maybe it's even in the same document, we'll infer that there's some kind of meaningful relationship between those terms. So that begins to extend a bit beyond the scope of rule-based methods and into more of a statistical representation of how often two words or phrases may co-occur. That can be especially powerful if you can normalize those terms to a controlled vocabulary or an ontology, as you can understand, okay, well, I see the same term occurring alongside this other term much more often than we'd expect statistically. So that begins to foreshadow more modern statistical methods as we saw the more recent emergence of sequence-based machine learning and the LSTMs, or long short-term memory approaches, and other neural network-based approaches for applied to natural language processing. We had much more rigorous statistical representations and higher level representations, more importantly, of the text that we'd see. So we entered a point where we could say, okay, well, we not only know how often this particular term will co-occur in a document, but we know what terms are more likely to be adjacent to it because we've ingested a large collection of text, and we've observed, okay, well, this is literally how often this term is likely to occur in this sequence, and here's what's most likely to occur next. We kept building on that idea, and by we, I mean the natural language processing researchers, until first we got these more foundational language models. We call them language models because at that point, we've essentially created a representation of enough language to capture not just the basics of word order and grammar, but let the decider decide. I am not the suggestion. Thank you. Yeah, but we're at that point we're essentially representing the basics of language as we understand it. And in the case of BERT, we're not just going in one direction, but in essentially the reverse direction, working backwards from a given word or phrase as well. And each of these methods may still be very effective for some some use cases. And in fact, BERT models are still in active use in some areas of biocuration, particularly areas like identifying gene names or disease names. They're still quite effective for that. But artificial intelligence, as we've seen, has seen an explosion as certain companies have released their most recent ever larger language models. I'll call this a kind of a wall of sound approach, because yes, there's a lot of hype out there, but it's actually hype that well is not entirely untrue. There was a recent presidential address given to the AAAI titled here, "Will AI write scientific papers in the future?" And here we're not talking just about the far future or even the medium future, but essentially now, yes, generative AI methods are capable of writing scientific papers. They have sufficient concept of language and even technical language to write papers that certainly look on their surface like they make sense. Now the jury is still out on whether they are useful contributions, but can they write papers? Yes. The group at Stanford University called Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence is now releasing an annual report concerning what AI essentially is good at now. And their most recent one found that AI is actually capable of beating humans on a subset of evaluations and tasks. There's some benchmarks where humans still are the leading experts, including things like image classification, reasoning based on images alone, and kind of understanding more complex English grammars. I'm sorry. I apologize. Those are areas where AI is actually increasingly better than your average human. But there are still areas like math where humans seem to be better for the time being. Now, I would argue, and this is without getting on too much of a tangent, that many of these evaluations kind of miss the point about the value of generative AI, and in fact, why we want to use these tasks to begin with. Of course, it would be great to have an AI that would be very helpful for things like understanding complex math and doing reasoning based on images. But I would argue that there are still areas where humans are going to excel at these areas where at least our current batch of generative AI methods are probably not going to outpace us anytime soon. There's a pretty good example of this I show on the right here in that Eric Topol, who is often a very big proponent of AI, particularly in the biomedical context, sees the potential for the eradication of medical diagnostic errors. And some of his evidence for this is a study by McDuff et al., where they found that LLMs were much more accurate in diagnosing clinical cases. And there's been related studies along those lines as well, including from our group. Finding, yeah, okay, well, depending on how you actually present the detail in the clinical case, in the actual clinical cases that you are presenting, yes, sometimes they do have more accurate diagnoses. The challenge being that they may not always be quite aware of some of the errors that you really don't want to make, and I'll allude to that in a couple of slides. Now, I did promise to actually try to describe in a bit more detail what LLMs are actually doing. And if you're not really familiar with any of this area at all, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the kind of the machine learning underpinnings. But suffice to say that much of this really just comes down to the sequence of words. All of this work back to neural networks, and back to the BERT models and the kind of the first wave language models and even more recent language models, really just comes down to likelihood of a given word or token, that is perhaps a chunk of a word in a sequence. So if you have a sequence like "where are we," you know that there are words that are much more likely to be next, like "where are we going," "where are we looking," "where are we staying," and words like "dog" are probably not likely to be next in that sequence. So if you kind of take the combined probability of those sequences, well, then you can begin to assemble those into a model. That becomes a very powerful model if you can assemble it from a large collection of diverse texts, which is exactly what modern large language models like the OpenAI's GPT models have done. Now, I think there's some underappreciated aspects of these models, and especially the way that most people access them. In the case of GPT models, through ChatGPT, and it's that the infrastructure is doing a lot of work as well. Some of that infrastructure happens kind of behind the scenes, where you had a lot of human feedback that went into designing the outputs of these models and ensuring that it generally does make some kind of coherent sense and is actually capable of answering questions and is much less likely to produce nonsense in its feedback. There are also guardrails in that process to ensure that it doesn't go completely, well, off the rails in its output. But perhaps most importantly, there's very, very easy interfaces to get to these models. I'm of the belief that much of the success of ChatGPT was really just that it's really easy to talk to. OpenAI set up systems where you can, literally just ask it questions. And people are already familiar with being able to ask search engines like Google their questions. So of course that's a very natural language kind of interface that people just find very easy to work with. Now, of course, there's a number of different use cases for something like this, even without adapting it and any further. Many of these are in research. Many of these are in more of a clinical sense. The models themselves are great collections of medical knowledge, and especially when you attach them, will give them the ability to search other resources. They're essentially just become very, very powerful search engines. So that's fantastic for learning on your own or learning in a biomedical context. So I would be remiss at this point if I did not mention some very specific downsides of LLMs. I really like this Big Bench language benchmark. This is a group, I believe, based at Google still, where they've generated a set of more than 200 tasks for evaluating language models and related approaches. With the primary goal of seeing whether, as you make these models larger, they are actually capable of performing better on these tasks. And it is not true that bigger is always better. There's about a third of their tasks, at least as of 2023, where they found that models were actually capable of this interesting phenomenon of emergent behavior, where they just hit a certain point where they are large enough that they do much better on tasks. Before that point, performance is middling to kind of randomly okay, but then they hit that point when they become sufficiently large where they're just much better. That's not always the case. There's a number of cases where performance just gradually gets better. You don't see this emergent phenomenon. It's just the more parameters you add to the model, the better it gets, sometimes kind of leveling off at a certain point. Sometimes the size of the model just does not matter. Its performance on the task remains about the same. In a small subset of tasks, there's even worse performance, or there doesn't seem to be any correlation at all. Now, in some cases, especially in tasks where you're trying to evaluate a kind of a non-fictional or a realistic answer to a question, there may be challenges in which the training data that's going into these models is including all kinds of different material, including potentially fictitious or literally fantastical claims. I mean, just that's the nature of language. For some models, including the GPT models, the exact training data going into them still remains unclear. So we have to work under the assumption that there are a number of fictitious claims that go into these models. Now, when we couple this with the fact that we see human-like performance, as that Stanford AI study mentioned earlier, even in biomedical tasks, we know that these models are not capable of human reasoning. They can simulate it. And at the same time, our ability as humans to determine whether a process has been done with human reasoning versus not is not very good. When you have generative AIs that are capable of producing language that is indistinguishable from that of a human, it becomes very challenging to tell what the thought process was behind it, or whether it even included any logic at all. Now, couple this with the existence of what's popularly known as hallucinations, but some people have tried to promote as confabulations instead. That is any output that looks like it could be believable, but really doesn't have any kind of basis in reality, or maybe just a partial basis at best. And you get what might be a dangerous situation. To me, this is a constant reminder that these language models are grounded in language. They are not grounded in fact. Any appearance to be grounded in fact is purely by coincidence, a happy coincidence, but a coincidence nonetheless. I would also maintain that the hallucinations are a feature rather than a bug. I think they are one of the nicest parts of generative AI, but it does mean that we need to be very careful with inferring any kind of logical ability to these models. Now, there has been some great work over the past couple of years in terms of how people interact with these language models, and I think this helps us touch on the question of, okay, what do we actually risk losing if we hand over more of the process of interpreting biomedical data and indeed using it to generate ontologies to computers. So this is actually from a great paper titled Artificial Intelligence and Illusions of Understanding in Scientific Research. And they identified these kind of three primary categories of illusions when you're relating to the output of generative AI. The first is this illusion that the model has a comprehensive understanding of any particular concept. It does not. It will try to convince you that it does. It may actually look like it has a very comprehensive understanding of virtually anything, but it is likely that it is a partial understanding at best, and again a simulacrum of human understanding. Similarly, there's shown in the upper right here, there may be a misunderstanding that a language model is capable of being comprehensive in its ability to generate hypotheses about a situation. This is actually an area where language models are, again, quite good at simulating that kind of output, but in practice, they are not actually doing very much of that under the hood. And in fact, it's likely that if you ask a language model to generate a hypothesis of a situation, it will really only capture a very small subset. Finally, there's this common misconception that the language models are somehow devoid of bias and are purely objective just by nature of having absorbed so many potential viewpoints. The argument here being that, well, instead they have absorbed all potential sources of bias and are not capable of reconciling them in any meaningful way whatsoever. So your AI output, similarly, will represent all potential standpoints and viewpoints rather than trying to resolve them in any kind of sense of objectivity. We cannot assume that language models themselves are objective or that they will output anything that is objective. So I'll touch on some very specific weaknesses that LLMs and generative AI have regarding ontologies specifically as well here. And the primary one is just they're just not designed to be very good at mapping in particular. So if we just go and ask GPT 3.5, and I believe this is still the case with the more recent 4 and 4.0 models, if you try to just get it to provide a corresponding identifier for Go from a given set of terms, and you give it essentially literally the labels for those terms, it will happily generate IDs, and it's likely that the vast majority of them will be incorrect. In some cases, it may actually try to modify the labels. It is likely that it will not connect the correct label to the correct ID. In some cases, it may completely invent new IDs or labels. There are, of course, ways to avoid this particular problem and bypass it entirely, which I will get into. But on their own, this is not something that LLMs are very good at, and in fact, they are not designed to be very good at this particular function. But it can be easy to mislead ourselves into believing that they're good at everything. And before we get outside the area of kind of LLM disadvantages and challenges, I do want to touch on this concept of whether curating biomedical knowledge is likely to still be a job for humans, because it does require us to address. I'm not going to solve any of these questions today, of course, but I think it requires us to address two major questions. First of all, who's actually accountable for errors that are made in this process, and then related to that, how do we ensure that the outputs of these models don't actually include certain outputs that we know will be very dangerous? In the biomedical context, this could be counterindicated therapies. This could be unlikely diagnoses. Often these may be errors that are completely invisible to non-experts, pardon me. Even back in 2018, when IBM was working on their Watson system, there were reports that, well, at least in testing, it recommended some unsafe and incorrect cancer treatments, which, looking back now, seems like pretty small potatoes in terms of the potential errors that a model could be making. More recently, in a study with GPT-3, some researchers who were trying to look at the ability of the model to do triaging. I don't actually remember what exactly Watson was using, Mark. Unfortunately, that might require a little bit more research. But yeah, at least in the case of GPT-3, it would happily produce claims about, okay, vaccines are not 100% effective. Vaccines can cause death. Vaccines are not tested for safety or effectiveness, which is not true. They are tested. But perhaps more dangerously, a more recent study found that when they asked GPT-3 to look at details about a patient with HIV and specifically meningitis, and then get it to write a management plan, it produced what, at least on the surface, looked like a great plan. Lots of details, lots of suggestions. But when clinical experts looked at it, they realized, oh, well, if we actually implemented this plan, it would likely make the patient's infection much worse and may actually be fatal. So certainly there are situations, especially in biomedicine, where the output from LLMs requires some kind of expert oversight, because the output will look great. Again, these models are based in text and not fact, so the experts need to provide the factual context. So with that all in mind, can we actually use LLMs to get some kind of structured data? Should we even be using them to get structured data? I believe they're still very powerful in the task of translating unstructured scientific data, often text data, directly into some kind of structured knowledge. Now, this does require us to do some work on our parts, unfortunately. It may mean that we have specific schemas or data models that we either already have or we need to design. These may actually be very, very complex schemas defining rather intricate relationships. Now, as part of this process, we may already want to link external unique identifiers. Certainly in the ontology space, we're very familiar with the value of having consistent and unique identifiers for our terms and concepts. But we may also want to be able to do a bit more with the knowledge that we get out of this process. We may be able to want to ask questions about the generative content or the underlying data in natural language. And that could include the underlying ontologies or sources or beyond. So all this is really leading into the fact that this Spires method is something that that our group designed to do exactly that. So Spires is based into a package that we call OntoGPT. This is all freely available online and actively tested in a variety of different use cases. But the basic idea here is that if you start with a schema, you define this in the LinkML language, you use the schema along with your input text to extract concepts and relationships from that text with this Spires method. This means that the language model does essentially the initial extraction. We do not actually ask the language model itself to do the mapping of identifiers or concepts. We just ask it, for example, identify all of the chemical names in this given text, or identify all the disease names and the relationships between a disease and a phenotype. And then, given those extracted terms, we go to our vocabularies, often sourced from ontologies. OBO ontologies work fantastically for this task, and we map them to the best we can find. In some cases, if we need to follow things like cross-references or other mappings, we can do that as well. The result is that we get structured data representing the extracted concepts and relationships that were present in our text. Now, this is especially useful to be able to do if you want to assemble knowledge graphs, because knowledge graphs, as you may know, are made out of relationships between specific concepts. So let's say you have a schema defining those types of relationships and a set of source texts. You can use OntoGPT with the Spires method to extract those structured relationships, assemble them using our KG Hub infrastructure, including some tools like COSA that are great for transforming data from different sources. But in practice, the data that you're going to get out of a tool like OntoGPT doesn't actually require that much transformation, or it may require a little bit of filtering and verification before you finally merge it into your final knowledge graph, especially if you want to integrate other sources with it. But what these methods are perfectly capable of generating organized hierarchical data and relationship between them. So in practice, this does improve over what GPT will be able to do on its own, even just using 3.5, which is increasingly a little unfair at this point. If we just take the in this case, I think it was just the abstract of this given study on Alzheimer's disease, and we say, okay, let's extract all the relationships between chemicals, diseases, or protein targets in this text. So ChatGPT with GPT-3.5 gives us that. It gives us a little table of relationships between chemicals and disease and protein targets. We didn't tell it what kind of format we wanted it in. We didn't tell it to resolve to any IDs. And in fact, when you do tell it to do that, it kind of does it. This is a small set, so there's less chance of error, but we can still do better. Using OntoGPT with Spires, we can pass it a schema defining chemical disease relationships. In this case, I did also cheat a little bit and use a more recent GPT-4 model. But when we pass it that abstract, well, it's capable of identifying, well, cyclopentaquinone, quinoline derivatives, and a relationship of treats with a mesh term. In this case, we just grounded mesh terms, and so we get the mesh for Alzheimer's disease. Again, this isn't something that the language model did. The language model was just responsible for extracting those initial relationships, which we saw it's perfectly capable of doing, but the mapping and the structuring is its weak point. So of course, we can even do this with a much larger collection of documents. OntoGPT has commands where it can go to PubMed and even PubMed Central, get a collection of full texts, and then collect all the concepts and relationships from that set. In this case, we went and we got saw a few documents on Werner syndrome. So we extract not only the named entities and we ground them to HP and Mondo terms, or in this case of one gene, an HDNC ID, and then we can structure that however our schema defines. So in this case, we have some terms that did not actually ground, perhaps because we didn't provide an ontology that contains specifically the term for early onset diabetes, or our mapping was just insufficient in that process. But either way, we got structured data from a collection of documents. Now, I referenced KGHub as a way that you could structure these results into a knowledge graph, and KGHub has some definite constraints to it. The primary one being is built into this larger infrastructure of assuming that you have some kind of a data model that's going to govern the types of relationships that you have in your resulting graph. This means that if you're using something like the BioLink model, then you already have a way to define the types of relationships that you'd see, for example, between a gene and a disease, or a gene and a drug. So you don't need to worry about that quite as much. This is especially powerful if you know that there are types of biomedical relationships that you are interested in representing in your graph, but are also represented in your target literature. So if you, for example, let's even get beyond literature and start talking about clinical records. If you have a variety of clinical records that say, okay, well, these patients have these particular phenotypes, and were diagnosed with these diseases. If you're missing additional information about, say, the genetic relationships involved in there, well, that's one job for a knowledge graph, where you can ingest these collections of patient presentations and diagnoses, and then merge them in with our knowledge about gene and disease relationships, and even take that one further and say, okay, well, these are the drugs that are targets of those diseases. Those latter steps can be all powered by existing resources, including knowledge graphs like the Monarch knowledge graph, but also the OBO ontologies that are very good at defining things like the exact disease IDs or phenotype IDs. So it is very powerful to have a consistent data model like BioLink, especially in situations like that, or even just for unifying the different types of knowledge that we have within OBO ontologies and beyond. For example, if you want to be able to bring in pathways from Reactome, well, there are already established protocols for bringing those in and unifying them with other sources like GoTerms from gene ontology, other ontologies like Ubron, if you want to be able to have a anatomical context, and indeed chemicals from sources like that. So let's say we have all those methods in place. How do we actually ensure that the resulting data will work with AI methods? Well, that's still an active area of research. I'm just going to do a quick plug here for the Bridge to AI consortium, which I'm part of. Bridge to AI is this quite a large project focused on defining best practices for generating data in the biological and biomedical space. Some of this comes down to identifying tools and, in some cases, existing standards for presenting and sharing that information. Some of it comes down to fairness and ethics of the data itself, and some of it comes down to how do we document the data and the process used to create these data artifacts. So this is still a very active project with some lofty but I think achievable goals, and I think they're all relevant to this discussion of how do we best apply the language models that we're generating. In practice, I believe much of this comes down to extracting metadata from data sets. It's even now, if you just choose any random data set, particularly a data set used to train some of the models that people are actively using, it may be very difficult to determine some of its details beyond what's in it. It may be very difficult to say, okay, what licenses or access restrictions actually apply to this. Where's the code used to generate it? What tools may be used with it? What format is it in? What version of that format? So at least in a biomedical context, some of this comes down to even just having basic knowledge of data standards. So that's one thing that Bridge to AI is working on. But the rest of it comes down to extracting data from, or rather the metadata from data sets. That can be an additional challenge because sometimes that metadata is stored in a variety of different places. Some of it may be in a GitHub repository, some of it may be in a published manuscript, some of it may be on a website or data portal. So with processes that we've implemented in OntoGPT and a schema based on the data sheets for data sets checklist, there are some ways where we can automate that process of extracting metadata from different data sets and having unified documentation for them. So at least that's human readable, but ideally also computer actionable. Now, of course, there's an entire ecosystem that we've been building out of tools in this space. All of these operate with both LLMs and ontologies to some degree. There's a Talisman project, which is built on OntoGPT, but Marcin and our group developed this to do gene enrichment analysis, or essentially, given a set of genes, it'll tell you in natural language what is similar about them. We have a method called Dragon AI, essentially for generating ontologies, components of ontologies based on RAG, or retrieval augmented generation methods. That's implemented in a platform called Curate GPT, which you can also try out. That's online as well. There's a tool called the Phenomics Assistant for working with Monarch resources and asking questions about them, as well as a paper on ascertaining how good GPT methods are, or GPT models are at doing some of the ID mapping that I alluded to earlier. More recently, and this is a work that hopefully will be published soon, but it is available as a preprint. We developed an artificial intelligence ontology for defining the types of methods and concerns that are out there in the AI space, because, well, in kind of a meta way, well, sometimes we even need to define the exact methods that are going on in any particular LLM-driven process or beyond. So I guess my closing thoughts here are, and I want to leave some, cool, so we still have some time for discussion as well. My stance on this is that AI is best at and should be doing the things that humans just are not capable of. AI, I don't think should be replacing human experts. I think that underestimates the value of both quite severely. If we want to be able to help in this process, I think methodological transparency is probably the best bet. I think generative AI is still a massively helpful tool, but so are data and metadata standards, and those don't get quite as much excitement behind them. So we can find some kind of data harmony in this process, but it may not quite sound like what we expect to assemble kind of an awkward musical metaphor. But with that, I'd certainly like to thank everybody in the Bebop group at Berkeley Lab, everybody in the Monarch Initiative. I feel like I left off a bunch of names here, but special thanks additionally to people shown on the right here who have been big helps with getting tools like OntoGPT off the ground, and there's been a variety of sources of support for this work as well. So with that, I will be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Harry, for this very, very interesting talk. I think we had some questions, so maybe we start with Leila's question. Can we use these models to find emerging concepts, or concepts that are not yet encoded and enshrined in any of the existing ontologies?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in fact, that's some of the focus of the Dragon AI method, and in fact, some of the other methods that are currently being built into the Curate GPT platform. Since that's built on more of this retrieval augmented generation paradigm, the focus there is in using existing resources to essentially feed those details to an LLM, have the LLM organize them in kind of its first step, and then use some kind of an additional structure to guide that further. For example, if you have you're trying to build out an ontology of, say, uh, different types of fruits. You can connect that to existing resources. You connect it to Foodon and say, okay, well, here are here's some structured relationships that we already know. You could point it at Wikipedia articles about apples, bananas, etc., and it'll use that as input for a generative process that will assemble it further. Chris even put together a great example lately of assembling a knowledge graph with this process in kind of a guided way. And I think, yeah, there we go. So yeah, he just dropped a link in there with the kind of the cookie cutter of that project, where you can use Dragon AI to do this process yourself and build a knowledge graph. Not from scratch, because, well, it has sources, but you can specify the sources for it.
Yeah, thank you very much. And everyone, just please show, speak, raise your hands, or just unmute yourself and ask questions. No one bites. So our speaker is very happy to answer anything that you want to throw at him. So I will ask one question, which is heavily on my mind at the moment. So the question of like, if we cannot really get rid of the human in the loop properly, like how much will these methods actually help us to scale? So if, let's say, we use like some of these experiments that Chris is showing in the chat there, if we use AI to generate knowledge base from 0 to hero, extracting from sources, and we have to actually look at every single record that is being generated afterwards and verify every single thing that the AI comes up with. How much do we actually save? And related to that, like in your own experience, what's the percentage of records that a human reviewer actually waves through and says, like, that's actually pretty perfect, we don't need to edit it at all? Like, is it 20%? Is it 10%? Is it 90% of the extracted information? So can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I think it really depends upon the specific use case and the types of things that one's trying to extract from the data. Because there's some things where it's just inherently easier to accomplish the task. Like if your idea is, say, okay, I just want to identify all the chemical names in this abstract. I mean, to be fair, there's existing NLP approaches that will reach 90% accuracy on a given piece of text, partially because the ceiling of potential matches is just it's in viewing distance. There's a limited number of potential chemical names, and some of the challenge is just identifying those instances where, I don't know, maybe something's spelled differently or it's just out of vocabulary. And those are instances where, under any circumstance, it will require some degree of human verification, just to say, okay, well, this is in fact the name of the chemical versus the name of something we are not considering a chemical. I think what is still going to be very challenging is relation extraction, and that is because of the nature of how we define relationships between things. Even if I try to extract protein-protein interactions, and that's perhaps one of the areas where the most work has been done in the biomedical biomolecular sphere. There's still going to be active debate about what constitutes a protein-protein interaction. Does it need to be a direct interaction? Does it need to be a physical interaction? Am I only concerned with certain types of proteins, and will I consider very transient interactions as part of my process? So by the time I've defined a very rigorous definition, there become a lot more points of failure for extracting those relationships, as those points of failure apply to human experts and computational methods. Now, it may just be that the computational methods are capable of understanding those instructions a lot more consistently. So again, it may be a case where you're not necessarily replacing the human curator entirely, but you are giving them a kind of a collaborator that is much more consistent. So if you view it even in terms of like inter-annotator agreement, well, this computational method may have a lot higher IAI or IAA with other human annotators, or even with other AIs than
Yeah.
than two or more biocurators.
I think this is a very good thought in the end, to say like, okay, this is not going to solve the scalability issue here, where we need to kind of curate billions of more pieces of information, and we don't have the people power to do this. But it's just going, or it is at least for now, going to make the curators more effective at their job. That's more kind of like, it seems, where this is at the moment. At Val, do you want to ask your question in voice?
I can do it. It's probably quicker. Yeah. So what did I ask? Sorry, I was typing another question as well. Yeah. So just hypothetically, if you fed, I know I'm not sure about the size of and the amount of information you can put into a model at any time, but say, like, for example, for fission yeast, the curated literature is 4,000 publications. Could you potentially and feed in those publications and you've shown regenerating a knowledge graph, small numbers of papers, but could you theoretically feed in all the papers and regenerate the knowledge graph that we've curated? And so probably the main point of failure, I would imagine, from the things that we've looked at just on a case-by-case basis, is getting the right gene names with the right connections. And part of that seems to be when looking at the tokenizers, and they don't recognize entire gene names so like for yeast gene names and for human as well, and the names are often a prefix and a suffix. So a gene SAD1 will be tokenized as SAD and 1. And then if there are usually multiple genes with the same prefix. And that seems to be the point where the names get switched out. So it doesn't actually probably go with the most common name in the literature, rather than it just like, oh, this is a gene and we'll stick it in. It almost seems as though the gene names need to be tokenized. I don't even know if this is how they work, but it just seems odd that you have to piece together these names from different portions. Would it help if the LLMs were trained on the actual names rather than pieces of names that it can plug together? Does that make sense? Or does it not make any difference?
And yeah, thank you for that question, Belle. I guess to address your first question of whether we can even do this to begin with, yes. Yeah, right now it takes some time, but yeah, we can happily put 4,000, 5,000 some papers through this process. One of the strengths of these LLM based approaches, I think, is their flexibility, and that does mean that for cases where, like, we know we have a cluster of related gene names, maybe they're mentioned in the same sentence or the same paragraph, we can literally instruct the model to say, okay, well, as a first pass, don't try to extract individual gene names, extract the context around the gene name, and then use that context to make a further conclusion. And that's one area where these approaches definitely differ from previous methods, where that would literally have to be a rule that would be part of our grammar or part of our model. But now if this is a case where we know maybe we're missing it, at least in something like OntoGPT, we can go back into our schema and say, hey, these are these are some cases where we need to pay additional attention. These are cases where we know this is how writers will write about these genes, especially in yeast, where we know that there's given formats. We can provide examples and we can say, hey, these also are gene names. We want to be able to extract these. So it's less about training the model itself and more just about giving it more specific instructions. And yeah, it's a process, but in the end, it works.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. It's good.
All right. I think we need to slowly stop. Thank you very much, Harry, for this very interesting talk. The talk will be is recorded, will be shared on our OBO Academy YouTube channel when it is processed, and we will share it in OBO Slack as always. So if you're not in there, contact us for getting an invite. Thank you very much for being here, and have a very great week.
Thanks all.